Ryan and I are going to have a presentation about Sitka National Historical Park's support for American, or for Native Alaskan arts. His presentation is a little bit more specific and it's a little bit more people-oriented. He's worked directly with a lot of the artists over the last 5 years, and he knows many of them really well from doing those programs together. So my role is kind of like to sort of go into the deep history of park support for Native Alaskan arts and culture, and sort of give some sort of previews of what may be coming up as well. So it really is an ongoing commitment. And I kind of meant that when I put it in the title. And it really started. I don't think it was intentional to begin with, but it has become an intentional act. And just some basics on the park. It's the first park in Alaska. It was originally a presidential park, just designated by Benjamin Harrison, and not actually. Congress didn't say anything about it. It was just supposed to be a presidential park in the new territorial capital of Sitka, and it was designated with a bunch of other types of public lands, including a military reservation, some public buildings in Sitka, and also some other public properties over in Juneau. And then in 1910, after the Antiquities Act, it was designated as a national monument, and it was one of the first national monuments in Alaska. It was reaffirmed in 1952. I didn't put that on the slide, but essentially Eisenhower reaffirmed all of the reasons why they had designated the monument, and in 1972, with the addition of Russian Bishop's House, it became Sitka National Historical Park rather than Sitka National Monument. And what I was trying to drive at here is that the change has really been one from a local park, kind of like a territorial capital park, to a real national historical park. And the other important thing is that the budget for the park went from being essentially volunteers taking care of a local park in the late 1800s and early 1900s to a park that now has a base budget of about $2 million a year. So it's quite a large operation, even though it's still the smallest park in Alaska. So when we talk about support, I like to sort of put a planning bent on it, and there are really some key events in the planning part of doing the park. And one was the inventory of the buildings on the transfer. And I put the background here. You can see that's the inventory map of all the buildings in Sitka in 1867 on the transfer. Castle Hill is that large. This look, that's Castle Hill. That's where the Polsons live now, out here on the island. And this is Sawmill. This was the original Sawmill Creek. It comes down from Swan Lake. There was a sawmill on here. And of course the park is way off on the edge of town. It wasn't really even considered to be part of Sitka at the time. As the town expanded eastward, the other thing that really designated the park was its western boundary with the mission and the development of Sheldon Jackson, what became Sheldon Jackson College, but the mission school and the mission property. And then from 1910 to 1960, there was a long period where the park was considered a national monument, but it was administered out of Glacier Bay. It didn't really have a local presence except for one maintenance person and eventually one interpreter. And there wasn't a visitor center to speak of. There were only some facilities there as of the 1950s. So there really wasn't any structure there. In terms of planning, one of the most interesting documents is the alternatives document that was developed between 1968 and 1971. It's an alternatives document that lays out a couple of different ways that the park could have developed. One alternative is pretty much the alternative you see now, with the Russian Bishop's House and the Totem Unit as separate units. Another alternative, interestingly, incorporated Castle Hill, the reconstructed blockhouse, and Building 29. And if you look at our general management plan, eventually everyone pretty much in town recognizes the architectural value of Building 29. It's the only other Russian constructed building in all of Sitka, and it's really the only one at this point that's not in public ownership. So the general management plan, which is this, is supposed to govern how we do everything, eventually contemplates us being able to purchase Building 29 and incorporate it into the park as part of the Russian theme of the park. I sort of went to the back, and this is the general management plan for the park. We still use that general management plan as kind of an overall guide for how to manage the park. And we also have an abbreviated version of that that's slightly different, called a foundation statement that was done in 2012. So our planning is pretty up to snuff. Now, when it comes to Native arts and culture, really the core park resources are fourfold. The 1804 battlefield and the fort site out at the mouth of the Indian River, the Totem Trail, memorial picnics is something that occurred in the parks, and that's like a cultural event that we haven't seen it as much in recent years, but it was a very long-standing tradition to have memorial picnics out at the mouth of the river, and then subsistence use of various different resources, even when the park was designated. And I wanted to throw this in here because just last year they had in Philadelphia, they had a huge garden show, the Philadelphia Flower Show. And one of the things that, because it was the bicentennial year, the centennial year for the National Park Service, they called out cultural landscapes from all around the United States. And the Totem Walk at Indian River Park, in general, was the landscape that represented Alaska at the Philadelphia Garden Show. And you can see that, this is a painting from the when was that? I don't remember.
1929.
Who said that?
Me, 1929, read the bottom caption.
Oh, good. 1929. Oh yeah, 1929. The Totem Walk has really been inspiring people for over 100 years at this point, and this is a watercolor that was done by a Canadian artist in the 20s. So, this is not the type of support that we really think of as supporting Native arts and culture, but this is the entry into the kind of the longest tradition that the park has had of supporting Native arts. So what is it? It's carving. It's this is basically the timeline of the major incidences when carving as an art form was supported by the park. Now, initially, you'll see that the 1930s effort was a civilian conservation corps effort, and it was managed by the Forest Service. But essentially, it was to re-carve some of the totem poles that had been put up on the Totem Walk in 1908 through 1910. So it was more for, the intent was more to recreate something for the tourist economy or for the visiting economy, but it started the ball rolling, and it also provided jobs for local carvers and kept the tradition alive in the community for the period between the late 1800s and the revival. I see the efforts from 1969 to the 1980s, kind of the revival period, where you see a lot of new poles being carved and a lot of older poles being recarved, sort of reinvigorating the whole tradition. And there are a few more incidents. The carving has really continued to this day in a more intensive way, and one that has not been so involved with purely doing things for the tourist industry, but to keep the carving tradition in and of itself alive. So, I mean, this is the CCC crews that were patching and recarving totem poles. Does anyone know who this is? I think it's George Benson. Anybody know any different? This is the activity of the Southeast Alaska Indian Cultural Center. The totem pole on the right was carved in 1996 and erected on the walk, well, in between the upper parking lot and the lower parking lot at the park. That's before the Serpentine Walk was put in, 1996. And then there was also other types of carving in addition to wood. There was a whole jewelry studio and carvings in metal and metal working as well. And then, of course, we have canoe carving. I mean, if any of you went to Steve Brown's talk, you know, we identified with SEALASKA Heritage that canoe carving was actually one of the most endangered carving techniques or carving traditions in the Southeast, and put a substantial amount of effort into getting the knowledge of how to do this passed to the younger generation. And this is the gal, it's Nick and Jared Gillannon.
No.
What?
It's Jared and TJ.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, TJ, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Good point, you took all the pictures though. And then as the Southeast Alaska Indian Arts Cultural Center developed, some of the other types of arts we also supported, including weaving and beading, and those were really carried on by initially by Emily Williams, Esther Littlefield, and Irene Jemmy. And the Southeast Alaska Indian Arts and Cultural Center first was an A&B, a branch of A&B, but then in 1993 was its own, became a nonprofit. And I wanted to show a couple of photographs of that. This is Irene Jemmy doing a hat. And this is one of Terry Rothgar's pieces. So I want to talk briefly about the Southeast Alaska Indian Cultural Center. From what I understand from listening to some of the tapes from Ellen Hope Hayes, Ray Gertis, who was the park historian in the late 60s, really supported the development of the cultural center and really encouraged Ellen Hope to join the Park Service and to sort of foster this resurgence of the arts and culture. And she and Charlie Olson developed the proposal from A&B to actually host all the artists in the Cultural Center wing of the Visitors Center, and along with A.P. Johnson. And that sort of got the ball rolling, and for a long time, like I said, they worked under the auspices of the A&B, but gradually transitioned to being their own 501c3. And I wanted to throw this in here because it really shows the cultural wing in the original Visitor Center was conceptualized as being this entire area here, and all these studio areas are still in existence. The internal, the way they've been laid out inside is different a little bit now than it was back then, but that entire wing was envisioned as a set of workshops. And they produced, in the early days, it was jointly run with the Indian Crafts Board from Washington. So there was additional supplemental monies that were dedicated to having the arts in the Visitors Center. It also provided a way for the clans to get together, and this was at the commissioning of the 1996 totem pole when it was raised. And the most recent thing that the most recent way that we've been supporting arts in the Southeast is through a series of demonstration artists with the Sitka Tribe of Alaska, and Ryan's going to cover that in a fair bit more detail. But we've also cooperated with SEALASKA Heritage to do the canoe carving. So this sort of gets to the kind of the end of what I was going to talk about, which is kind of where we're going, ongoing and future support. Right now we are in discussions, or compacting discussions with the Sitka Tribe of Alaska for assuming some functions at the park, including at least part of interpretation and the resources function at the park. This compacting is consistent with the Indian Self-Determination Act, and one of the things that's going to condition the cooperative effort is that it needs to make financial sense for both the park and the tribe. So we want to make sure that if it goes forward to the benefit of both parties. And that's consistent with the self-governance and a government-to-government type relationship that we have with the Sitka tribe. Other types of partner projects that we will have ongoing support for: the demonstration artists, the winter workshops that we've done successfully for a couple of years, and we also have we've talked a little bit about doing apprenticeships as well, but that's in preliminary discussions at this point. Another thing that we're working on is partner projects for building knowledge and long-term written records of Tlingit landscape and knowledge base. So right now we have a cooperative agreement with SEALASKA to do a Tlingit-oriented history of Shiatika or Shitka, including incorporating a lot of the place names that have been developed through Goldschmidt and Haas from the 1950s, and other oral histories that can feed into that broader history of Shitka as a Tlingit homeland. We also have a project, an upcoming project, to relocate the Tlingit village that was around Indian River. And that, if you read through our general management plan, that's something that's called for, but we hadn't really pursued it up until just a few years ago. And we've also talked about doing additional demonstrating in and around the park, showing things like traditional fishing methods, fish processing methods, things like that. Something that is a broader look at the culture that's been here in Southeast for so long. Another thing that I've tried to do in the last year is reach out to the Sitka tribe. So over the past summer, I took all of our funding sources and our ways of getting funding through the National Park Service to them to see if they could find ways that we could put together partner projects that would benefit both the tribe and the park. And hopefully we'll be able to get a couple of those type of partner projects together by the next combined call. But you know, the Park Service, like the tribe, doesn't work on the fastest timeline. So there'll be many years to do that. So it's a long-term discussion, not something that we're going to do tomorrow. That's it.